Hi everyone, my name is Stefani Martorella and I'm a biology student with an interest in philosophy, especially the moments where an ancient idea illuminates a modern scientific problem. In this presentation, I want to invite you into one of those moments. I'll be asking whether an audacious claim from a pre-Socratic thinker, Anaxagoras, can help us make sense of two contemporary frameworks, epigenetics in biology and distributed cognition in cognitive science. My claim is not that Anaxagoras predicted these theories, but that his metaphysical picture offers a surprisingly fertile lens for thinking with them. Let me set the scene for you. Picture yourself in Greece. Think of those Greek columns. Imagine the wind moving through these columns, marble warmed by sun, and somewhere in that world, a thinker proposing that every substance contains every other substance. Now jump to a laboratory bench with pipettes and a fluorescent microscope. Think of DNA and the double helix. These images seem to belong to different planets. But what if they're two snapshots of the same inquiry? How complex wholes arise from two interwoven parts? Now, this idea might be new to some, but let me help you set that scene. Pretend you're in ancient Greece. Think of those columns that everyone famously knows. Think about the wind rolling through those columns, the marble warmed by the sun, and somewhere in that old world is a thinker who's proposing an idea that every substance contains every other substance. Now jump to something that you might more commonly know, a laboratory. Think about the laboratory bench filled with pipettes, a fluorescent microscope, other common laboratory equipment. And now these images seem to be from different planets. But what if they're two snapshots of the same inquiry? How complex wholes arise from interwoven parts? Here's the specific thesis that I'll be proposing and defending today. Anaxagoras proposed a principle that in everything there is a portion of everything. This can serve as a conceptual basis, an organizing lens for understanding why epigenetic traits and cognitive processes are best seen as relational, context-sensitive, and systemic, rather than as isolated, one cause, one effect mechanisms. In other words, his metaphysics help us notice what our best sciences already imply. Why does this matter for you as a listener, you might ask? Because how we picture causation changes how we practice science now, how we design interventions, and even how we assign responsibility. If genes are not destiny and minds are not sealed containers, then the levers we can pull, nutritional, social, educational, environmental, will look very different. Let's start with Anaxagoras' core ideas. From there, we'll move on to epigenetics in biology, and then we'll go on to distributed cognition in cognitive science. Now, these terms might be new for some people, and for these bigger words, I'll provide visuals that will help to understand the true meaning behind these words. Then from there, we'll tackle objections. Some people might have questions or deny these allegations of my thesis on Anaxagoras, so this will help with some questions that might be posed. Lastly, we'll consider payoffs and implications of this theory. Like I said, along the way, I'll provide visuals that will help to understand some of these key concepts. Now, before we dive in, let's picture two images in our mind. On the left, we'll picture starry Greek night above the Aegean, and on the right, we can think of the more biological side and think of a time-lapse of cells differentiating inside of a petri dish under a microscope. The common thread, the common factor between these two images is differentiation within mixture, order emerging from entanglement. That, in one phrase, is our through line, what this entire video is going to be about. Now, to continue throughout the video, let's talk about the plan for attention. Firstly, I'll be making the arguments about all the theories in my thesis. Then from there, I'll make that argument even more stronger, concise, and understandable to even someone that might not understand these bigger terms. Then from there, I'll test the argument against its strongest critics, some of those objections I was referencing before. If it survives those tests, even partially, it's earned a place in a conceptual toolkit that could be used in studying this philosophical sciences later. If it doesn't, you'll at least have a clear map of where it breaks. Now, two ground rules to keep us honest. First, I will not smuggle modern science back into the past. I'm using Anaxagoras as simply a lens, not as a lab report. Second, I won't rely on mystical and unknown language. Wherever it is possible, I'll use plain language and visuals to help break down some of these larger concepts. Operational terms so the connections are falsifiable in spirit, if not directly experimental. Now, without further ado, and after all of this introduction jargon, let's take a deep breath and meet Anaxagoras. Now, like I said, it is time to meet Anaxagoras. So the big question is, what is Anaxagoras' theory? So to begin, Anaxagoras is a 5th century BCE pluralist, where the monist looked for a single underlying idea of stuff such as water, fire, air, earth, numbers. He argued for a world fundamentally composed of many irreducible stuffs. He called these stuffs seeds or ingredients, and the radical claim is that every portion of reality contains all of the seeds necessary to go on in life, though in different proportions. And that is the first pillar, universal mixture. The second pillar we'll be talking about is predominance. Anaxagoras says, in effect, that what a thing appears to be reflects which ingredients dominate in it. So bone is most manifestly bone because bone ingredients predominate there, even though flesh ingredients, air ingredients, and so on are also present in bone. This is not a mere metaphor for contamination, but more so a precise claim about constitution and explanation. The third pillar we'll be talking about is infinite divisibility. If you divide anything, you never arrive at a pure single ingredient. You'll only reveal other parts of this, another mixture per se with altered ratios. On this picture, purity is an idealization we impose for convenience, not a state that the world actually affords. Now, the question that's posed is, how does order emerge if everything is always mixed with everything else? Now we can enter nous, or the mind. Anaxagoras describes nous as the only unmixed thing on the world, a distinct principle that initiates motion and sorts mixtures into discernible structures. Be careful here. We need not treat nous as supernatural, because that's not what is meant to represent. We can treat it as a principle of organization, the name he gives to patterning, sorting, and catalyzing in a universe of mixtures. To see the bite of this view, compare it with atoms. The atomists say indivisible, qualitatively simple atoms combine in the void to yield complex bodies. So atoms are smaller objects that are used in this world to make up everything. Anaxagoras flips the script. The basic units are already qualitatively complex. Combination and separation change ratios, not kinds. That inversion reorients how we think about causation, affects track shifts in predominance rather than the mere presence or absence of a specific type. Now consider an everyday analogy that we hear quite often. Think about a smoothie made from any fruits, nuts, spices, dairy. No sip is ever pure mango, or pure almond, or pure apple, whatever it may be. It's always a blend. Yet, some sips taste more mango forward or almond forward depending on local concentrations. The smoothie isn't atomism, it's Anaxagoras. And that helps to show theories that we just spoke about, that not everything is purely one thing, like atomists like to say, but as Anaxagoras likes to say, that blend is made up of a bunch of mixtures. Now, this analogy also refers to one of Anaxagoras' major concepts, metaphysics. This metaphysics also carries a methodological caution. When we isolate things in analysis, we gain clarity, but we risk lying to ourselves about the world's entanglements. Anaxagoras is reminding us that isolation is a tool, not a truth. The real is relation, through and through. Let's park one last feature for later use. On Anaxagoras' view, explanation often involves context. What surrounds a thing, how that surrounding shifts ratios of ingredients. Let's hold on to that for later use. It will be the hinge between his ancient picture and our discussion of genes and minds. Now, as we wrap up this first part of meeting Anaxagoras and understanding his theory, we're going to shift into our first discussion point, which is epigenetics. Now we're entering the world of epigenetics. So let's put ourselves into a biology lab. But before we do that, I'll be right back with some necessary tools. Okay, now I'm ready to enter a biology lab. Now, for much of the 20th century, a popular metaphor framed DNA as a blueprint that the organism simply reads off. The epigenetic revolution complicates that metaphor. Gene expression, which genes are transcribed and when, is modulated by chemical marks, chromatin structure, cellular signals, and environmental inputs. The sequence matters, but so does the setting of that sequence. Let's make this concrete. Two individuals can share a gene variant associated with a trait, yet display two different outcomes because methyl groups attach to DNA near that gene, or because histone proteins wrap the region more tightly or loosely, or because signaling cascades in the cell either amplify or dampen transcription. Now, visual here to picture is think about methylation, tagging, appearing and disappearing. Here's the Anaxagorean resonance. The organism traits are mixtures in which many influences are present, and the phenotype that shows up is most manifestly the one whose influences predominate at that time. In that tissue, under those conditions, genes are ingredients, yes, but so are diet, stress, circadian rhythm, microbiome composition, and social context. Identical twins offer an intuitive illustration. Early in life, their epigenetic profiles are often extremely similar. As they accumulate different experiences in life, their profiles diverge and separate from one another, and with them, the expression patterns that scaffold health, behavior, and risk. The DNA sequence is stable. The mixed ratios of regulatory influences do shift. On Anaxagoras' map, the seeds of many outcomes are present from the start, and what changes is predominance. Now let's consider development as a whole. Cells in an embryo always share the same genome, yet differentiate into muscle, neuron, or skin because local signaling environments push different expression programs to predominate. The genome is not a script that runs linearly. It is a library accessed differently as contexts change. Anaxagoras helps us to narrate that. No tissue is pure of others because each tissue contains the potential ingredients of all others but displays what predominates. We can also think ethically here. If phenotypes depend on mixtures that include social and environmental aspects and inputs, then responsibility for outcomes cannot be placed solely on an individual's bad genes. Interventions become systemic. Nutrition programs, toxin reduction, stress amplification, stress mitigation, and social support are not add-ons. They're part of the causal fabric. Anaxagoras' vision encourages that widened lens. Here's a useful refrain for the lab and for the clinic. When a trait surprises us, appearing or disappearing between generations or contexts, ask not which gene did it, but more so which mixture has changed. Sometimes the mixture is biochemical, sometimes it's psychosocial, or oftentimes it can be both. Now, to help us better think about this, we can think about the structure in which organisms start from the ground up to its environment. So this way, it starts all the way from genome and goes all the way up to its greater environment. In that segment, it goes from genome, epigenome, to cell, to tissue, to the organism, eventually ending up at that environment as a whole. One more bridge to think about. In epigenetics, marks can be stable or plastic. Some wash out while others persist across cell divisions. Anaxagoras' infinite divisibility invites us to expect continuity across scales. A mark at one scale is mirrored by constraints and affordances at adjacent scales. That's a speculative analogy, but it orients our curiosity towards multi-level causation rather than single-level stories. Now, let's get out of the biology lab and head into the cognitive science department to talk about distributed cognition.
Okay, so now we're going to focus on distributed cognition. So now we're going to pivot to the mind. The standard image of cognition treats the brain as the sole location of thinking. Distributed cognition challenges that image by arguing that cognitive processes are spread across the brain, body, artifacts, and our social partners. The working system is the unit of analysis, not the skull-bounded individual. Picture a commercial flight. Think about what an airplane looks like, the cockpit, think about the pilot, the co-pilot, everything that involves a plane. Now, specifically, we're going to focus in on being in that cockpit. So let's pretend we're a pilot. The captain consults instruments, narrates checklists, coordinates with air traffic control, coordinates with his co-pilot, and cross-checks with the first officer. Where is the calculation of descent rate? It's partly in memory, partly on the altimeter, partly in the procedural script read aloud, and partly in the social practice of call and response. Thinking is happening across the entire system involved in this process. Now, to bring this down to everyday life, when you outsource remembering a meeting to your calendar app, or when you do long division on paper, or trying to do it mentally, or when you solve a maze by tracing your finger and not using any aided tools in a secondary sense, the tool is a component of the cognitive process. Your mind functionality is momentarily larger than your body. Anaxagoras' picture resonates because it refuses isolation. Just as physical substances are never pure, cognitive processes are never purely neutral. They're mixtures. They consist of neural activity plus bodily posture plus environmental structure plus artifact design plus social coordination and many more. The predominant element changes with the task. Sometimes memory will dominate, sometimes external representation will. Nous, or again the mind, recast as an organizing principle, maps here to pattern-sensitive coordination. In a complex system, order emerges when components align to amplify signal and dampen noise. The mind of the cockpit is not a ghost. It's the organized activity of many parts. Anaxagoras' language gives us a way to name that without reducing it to one privileged locus. Now let's think about a case study in biology. So let's go to a surgical team. Now within a surgical team, there is many parts it is made up of. The lead surgeon, an anesthesiologist, other surgeons, scrub techs, monitors, alarms, and a long standardized checklist form a thinking system. Decisions are not located in a single head. They're distributed, rehearsed, and made legible within that room. When the checklist predominates, errors drop. When ego predominates, errors rise. The predominance as an exploratory lever. This has many design implications. If we accept that minds are distributed, we will design tools, interfaces, and spaces that help to shape cognition deliberatively. Clear affordances, redundancy where failure is costly, and calm visual hierarchies where attention is scarce. Anaxagoras cues us to treat the environment as part of the mind's mixture, not as background scenery. Now finally, in the last part of this distributed cognition helps us to reframe responsibility. We do hold individuals accountable, but we also hold systems to account: training practices, interface, design, team norms. If a system reliably produces these specific errors, we'll fix the mixture, not just one individual person. And this stance helps us to follow naturally from Anaxagoras' anti-isolationism. Now we're going to move on to a big topic that is very important, and that is objections. The question of the altercations between epigenetics and distributed cognition do have many objections, so we're going to address some of them in the next part. Okay, so I've got my thinking cap on as we proceed to talk about objections. Now, it's important to not have bias with this and to hear all sides equally. So the first objection I'm presenting is the idea that this could be anachronistic. You're addressing modern science in antique robes and old ideas. So with this, I would agree it would be wrong to claim historical prediction, and I'm not trying to do that. More so, I'm trying to offer a philosophical analogy that clarifies patterns we observe now. The criteria for usefulness is not fidelity to Anaxagoras' intent, but whether the lens helps organize and interrogate contemporary evidence. Now, let's move on to a second objection that someone might pose. Now, the whole idea of Anaxagoras and this has revolved around metaphors. So with the second objection, metaphors can mislead, mixture talk is too vague. Now, this is true. Metaphors can both reveal and conceal. So the safeguard is operationalizing. Can we translate the metaphor into measurable questions? Now, in what we spoke about, like epigenetics, which mixture changed, becomes a program of assaying marks, mapping pathways and modeling interactions. In the cognition part, it becomes task analyses that track information flow across bodies, tools, and settings. Now moving on to a third objection. Nous sounds like dualism smuggled in. Nous, again, is that idea of mind, so it can be read that way, but it need not to be. In the presentation, I use nous as a placeholder for organizing dynamics, attractors in state space, control parameters in dynamical systems, or information processing constraints that help to shape flows. If the word bothers you or feels uncomfortable, it's easily able to be dropped, but the functional role will continuously remain. Now, a fourth objection that I came up with is atomism actually underwrites modern science. Anaxagoras is messy. Now, the idea of Anaxagoras might be really confusing, and atomism is a fundamental concept of science. So atomism has been incredibly fruitful, but modern science already lives beyond simple atomism. Complex systems, network biology, ecological psychology, and embodied cognition all model relational causation. Anaxagoras is not a replacement, but a complementary ancestor for these strands and these roots, so more so just building off of these ideas. Now, a fifth objection I pose is, isn't everything in everything, that idea posed by Anaxagoras, trivially true if you stretch everything? This can be seen as true, but not if we cash it out as a specific explanatory commitment. The first one being no absolute isolation, the second one being predominance explains appearance, the third one being divisibility reveals more mixture, and the fourth one being organization is required for stable form. These were all things that we spoke about in introducing Anaxagoras, and those are testable in spirit. We can look for isolation failures, predominance effects, multi-scale mixture, and organizational dependencies. Now, a sixth objection is, where are their predictions? Philosophy rarely predicts empirical specifics, but it can generate research heuristics. Look for hidden contributors in surprising phenotypes, analyze tasks at the system level, expect multi-level interactions, design interventions that alter mixtures rather than one variable at a time. If those heuristics pay rent, guiding better models or safer systems, the LEN has earned its keep. So that helps to wrap up the idea that these predictions are present and not hidden. The seventh objection is you're conflating constitution with causation, which is an easy misconception that can be seen. That is a good thing to notice, but the talk distinguishes them. Seeds are about constitution. Predominance and organization are about causal process. In epigenetics, methyl marks constitute a regulatory landscape, and signaling and chromatin remodeling cause shifts in its expression. In cognition, artifacts constitute the system. Coordinated practice causes reliable performance. So that's where the constitution and causation go hand in hand, but not mixing. Now, the last objection that I have presented is, what about counter cases where isolation does work? And we, in fact, keep those. So Anaxagoras doesn't forbid simplification. He warns against mistaking it for the whole story as a bigger picture. Where isolated models explain, use them. Where they fail, try mixture and organization models. The stance is pluralist, not purist. So that's why these are interchangeable, and isolation can work and we can keep those. So now that objections have all been settled, I'm going to take my thinking cap off and we're going to move on to theoretical payoffs. So now we're going to talk about the payoffs. So the first payoff that we're going to talk about is conceptual coherence across domains. And now to start, first off, we can begin by saying payoffs are just kind of like the final outcomes that be presented and I guess benefits, you could say. So in answering the first one of conceptual coherence across domains, by naming mixture and organization as common structures, we avoid reinventing the wheel in each field. Biologists and cognitive scientists can talk across disciplines without false translation because they do share a map of parts and relation and context-sensitive predominance. Now, a second payoff to talk about is better questions. Instead of asking what gene causes X, we can ask under what mixtures does X predominate and how can we nudge the mixture. Instead of asking who made the mistake, we ask how did this system shape the error and how can we reshape the system. Now, in changing these questions, they're more actionable, more likely to get a better posed response and a more direct, concise answer. Now, a third payoff is methodological humility. If the word is deeply entangled, our models are necessarily selective cuts. We become explicit about their scope and failure modes. That humility paradoxically
paradoxically increases reliability, and this is good because the more reliable something is, the better it is for future understanding and science as a whole. So because of this, we stop overclaiming and start iterating designs that acknowledge context. The fourth payoff is ethics of interdependence. When outcomes are mixture dependent, justice demands attention to background conditions, nutrition, pollution, housing, education, interface design, and so on, not just the individual efforts. Responsibility scales up to institutions and designs that configure the mixtures people live in. Now, a fifth payoff, education and communication as a whole. Teaching with mixture metaphors helps non-specialists grasp why Gene 4 stories mislead and why Mind in the Head stories omit these crucial factors. It also helps future scientists and designers adopt systems thinking early, which prevents brittle solutions later on. Now, a sixth benefit is research programs. In biology, map mixtures across development and environment. In cognition, map information flows across tools and teams. Now, within both, test interventions that shift organization rather than only components. If Anaxagoras nudges us towards those programs, he's doing all the real work for us, and that's kind of what he was aiming to do. Now, and the seventh payoff is design principles. Build environments, labs, hospitals, plane cockpits, classrooms that make the right ingredients will predominate. Clear signals, friction for dangerous actions, redundancy for safety critical data, and affordances that align posture and attention with task demands. If we treat space as part of mind and health, not as a backdrop, it is better for this idea of principle designs being as relevant and important. Now, moving on to the last payoff, number 8, is personal practice and well-being. On a human scale, we can curate our own mixtures: sleep, light, movement, social contact, and tools that extend memory and focus. That's not self-help fluff, but it's an applied mixture management. Small shifts in predominance accumulate into stable patterns over time. Now, this segment concludes all of the payoffs and benefits, and lastly, we're going to wrap this all up.
Okay, lastly, let's gather our philosophical threads. Anaxagoras offers 3 durable ideas. Everything is mixed with everything, which has been the main focus of this. What shows up depends on what predominates, and stable form requires organizing dynamics. I've argued that these ideas resonate with how we understand genes and minds as products of relational, context-sensitive systems, and I've done this through the idea of epigenetics in a biological setting and distributed cognition in a cognitive science setting. If that resonance holds for you even a little, then an ancient metaphysician has helped you see a modern lab bench and a modern cockpit with clearer, fresher, better understanding eyes. And that's an extreme win for philosophy, not because it replaces science, but because it sharpens our questions and broadens our sense of what counts as a cause. So this is my closing invitation, my closing question and statement. When you next encounter a tidy single cause story, whether it be about a trait, a behavior, a success, or maybe even a failure, try asking a question that we might hear by Anaxagoras. What mixture made this, and what organization sustains it? If you can answer that, then you are already thinking like a true systems scientist. For those who like visuals, then you can rewatch with overlays I've mentioned and images that I've helped to paint, ruins and DNA to set the mood, mineral cross-sections and smoothie swirls to picture mixtures, methyl tags and chromatin to picture regulation, a plain cockpit and checklist in OR to picture distributed thinking, and layered diagrams to help picture multi-scale causation. They help to slow everything down and better understand the bigger words that I'm saying and anchor the abstractions. So thank you for lending your attention to a conversation that has been a problem across millennia, going all the way back to Anaxagoras being from BCE. And if you disagree, I hope I've at least given you a sharper way to disagree and shown you some relevant points on the other side. If you agree, I hope you'll try the lens in your own domain and report back what it reveals and where it breaks. So
So I'm Stefania, and this has been a tour from Annex courses to epigenetics and distributed cognition. May your mixtures be extremely well organized and your predominant ingredients be the ones that you would choose.